So with that, let's get together with a panel discussion. And we'll go about till about 7:30. We'll have time for Q&A. And then we'll go upstairs and we have more wine and appetizers. So you all get to actually meet some of the panelists one-on-one as well as talk to the rest of them. So welcome everyone. Thank you for taking the time. So I'll do a softball. Why don't we take a minute each, give your intro and also your interest in D&I. Carmen, we'll start with you.
That's a memorable intro. And I mentioned this because I'm a cognitive neuroscientist. I focus on memory. And we work with a lot of organizations to enable them to create and deliver memorable messages. The reason we consider that's important in business is because all of your customers will make decisions in your favor based on what they remember, not on what they forget.
Bernard?
Hope I don't have feedback. Okay. Hi, I'm Bernard Coleman. I'm with Uber Technologies, Inc., or just Uber as most people call it. I'm the head of diversity and inclusion. Been there about a year and a half. The larger balance of my career has been in politics, but my sole mission is to help make Uber more inclusive. So I say it's an extension of my work that I did on campaign, just making sure that people feel welcome, that it's equitable treatment, and there's representation anywhere I would have ever worked or want to go. So that's the sole purpose of the work that we do at Uber, and that's basically soup to nuts from when you are a prospective hire wanting to come to work at Uber to when you leave. What was your experience like? What was your experience like? There's a quote by Maya Angelou where she talks about, you remember how you're treated, but you remember all the different things, but you mostly remember how you're treated. So I'm totally mingling her quote, but it's that treatment that you remember. So,
Well, Monika?
I'm Monika Fahlbusch. I'm at Memzy Software, and I think this topic is something that my entire career here in Silicon Valley and San Francisco we've talked about, and I don't think we've made a lot of progress. So I will not retire until we've made some real progress. And I think if it's going to happen, it's going to happen here in this creative, innovative environment. So I'm committed.
Fantastic.
I'm Ashutosh. I'm the CEO and co-founder at Eightfold, AI personalized training. And from what I've seen, building teams in different companies, whether it was IBM, Google, Bloomreach, and now at Eightfold, humans have both conscious and subconscious biases, and that limit the success of an individual, but also the success of the organization and enterprise at a large, right? And that is fundamentally limiting to our society. So our goal over here is how we can help with that. How can we help people fight their own biases?
Fantastic. Elle?
I'm Elle Odysseos, currently the Director of Partner Marketing at Apttus. And I'm interested in discussing gender parity and challenging the stereotypes of the millennial.
Glad you mentioned that before I mentioned that tag. So this is the second time we're having a panel like this. First time we assembled the panel, very distinguished panel, but there was no representation of the millennials. So we did have one, and this time we ensured that we did have that. And by the way, millennials don't like being called millennials. So we're perpetuating the bias right out the gate. So as we set the tone for the panel discussion, we're talking about deconstructing bias at work. How do each of you see the relationship changing between the employer and the employee with technology or with AI in play in the workplace now? Whoever wants to go first. You want to go first?
Sure. I'll start. It's intriguing to study your employees or people that you want to hire from a neuroscientific perspective, because everybody in your audience has a brain. And I know you may smile at that because sometimes you may not see the evidence of that, but we all do. We all have a brain. And as we observe the brain's interaction with technology, that's an intriguing experiment in itself. And I have the deepest admiration for your company because you're trying to get into the space of automating intelligence. And quite often to do that, we learn lessons from the brain, because what's the best predictive engine on the planet? It is the brain. So where technology is concerned, we're noticing two things that I think we all ought to be concerned about: distractions and multitasking. Anybody guilty of those things? Not people here, but people that you know. For distractions, you have to be cautious, because if we talk about deconstructing biases, biases are perpetuated by what we pay attention to. And when we are distracted, then you're not in charge of what you're paying attention to. I was intrigued to find out about this app that's called Email and Walk. Have you seen that app? it turns your camera on your phone on so that as you're walking and you're typing your email, you can actually see where you're going. So we have reached new levels of distraction, so be very cautious because we're perpetuating biases in the way where we don't really know where the brain is paying attention to. So that's distractions number one. Multitasking is another culprit where technologies are now enabling us to constantly have this illusion of multitasking. And unfortunately, what we can show from science is that when you multitask, you lower your IQ by about 8 to 10 points. Smoking marijuana only lowers it by 4 points. So be cautious about how we promote technologies in the sense of when we do not really pay focused attention and we switch between tasks very frequently, then it will be a lot harder to deconstruct bias because we don't know what the brain is looking at.
Interesting.
So the one thing people are going to remember from this panel is that smoking marijuana is better.
So, you know, my daughter is an audience and I'm now worried. What do I need to actually delete? Anybody else?
I think that what I'm interested in is how all of this will take us in terms of insights, because I think we're in a data-rich environment for sure, and as employers we get inundated with data and as employees, but the conversations that I find myself in are, well, that's great data, but what's the insight? What does that tell you? And I think that's something that we have a lot of work to do still.
Great.
So I think a lot of the conversations that people still find uncomfortable discussing in the workplace in person are now happening online, and people now have the visibility into things like compensation and bonus packages and understanding opportunities, and there's a lot more visibility available online that people don't feel comfortable discussing one-on-one.
Right. So, Bernard, when we talked last week, you talked about enterprise readiness. So tell us a little more about what you mean by enterprise readiness.
Yeah, when I think enterprise readiness, basically enterprise is your organization. So how ready is your organization for diversity and inclusion? When I've been in other organizations, you can bring all the best practices you want to any organization, but if it's not ready for the message, it will wholesale reject what you're trying to do. I think the most important thing that I would have learned working in D&I, but in any organization for that matter, is you can't push people too far. You have to know, are they ready, prime them for getting ready, and then and follow several steps to make sure that the readiness sticks. Because once you do that readiness assessment, then you know what the tolerance is. Then after that, you can then develop the plan of action, you can refine, and make sure you have the repetition there to make sure that the process plays through. But if they're not ready for it, the one thing I know is people don't like being told what to do. So you want to help them find their why and make sure the enterprise is ready for the message.
So how do you test this thing? Because to some extent it seems like you need to take 2 steps forward and then you may realize that you need to take a step back.
At Uber, we do a lot of pilots. We pilot, and then you can then prove the hypothesis. So if you pilot it, you say this was the test case, this is what we did here. You then do a postmortem to understand was it successful or unsuccessful, or what things could we tweak. And then after that, then you can see how you scale it. So it does work, but you do it in bite-sized pieces. Because somebody says, how do you eat an elephant? Bite, bite, bite. So that's what we do, and just test things out. And when I've been in some organizations, you just try. And you throw it at the wall and see what sticks. Don't know that's the most effective way, but that was the campaign, and you didn't have a lot of time. With Uber, basically goes on and on and on. Here's my intro music.
You turn that off?
Truly, you just want to test it out, and just know that I think the other part of that is if you're going to take 1 step forward, sometimes 2 steps back, managing expectations, letting people know exactly what you're doing, and being really transparent in the process, saying this is a test, and we might not work out here, and it might not work out there, but this is our goal, and this is what we hope to achieve. I think if you don't prime people and set the narrative, otherwise it could be a failing endeavor because people don't know where you're going. So you have to be really, really transparent. I think back to your question on technology. Technology is democratizing data and helping people get the transparency, understand themselves in the process.
So prior to Uber, for 2 years, you were responsible for D&I for Hillary Clinton's election campaign. So you talk about enterprise readiness. 2 years ago, Was the country ready for a woman president?
Well, I would say yes because we want a popular vote. But I'd say, but partly no. I mean, when we look at the state of the world, the United States, it is, I would say, it's regressed a bit. The pendulum swings left and right. And so every time you make progress, there's some people who want to, that might feel uncomfortable for them and they want to take it back. So I think we find ourselves at this interesting inflection point. So while the majority of the country was ready, there's a lot of too fast, too soon. And I think that's what we're seeing manifest now.
So you were just sharing some very interesting stats. Do you mind sharing them, where you started, because you were there pretty much on day one? And what did you achieve during that campaign from a D&I perspective?
Our goal aspirationally was to be more than 50% women and 30% people of color. And so that was aspiration, you know, like, well, maybe we won't get it. So at the end of the campaign, we were 55% women and 38.5% people of color, which is great because that matched the voting age population. When you compare 2008 to 2016, you want to have, if you could have matched Obama's numbers, which we kind of did, then that was the goal. So that was something we were very proud of. So that to get the staff to that level was an incredible undertaking, but everyone was aligned. That's what makes Uber versus in tech companies versus Hillary campaign, everyone's aligned from day one, you know it. Other than that, when you're on a campaign, I mean, when you're in a tech company or any other company for that matter, everyone's at a different station in life. And so you're trying to help them find their place in the journey.
Excellent. So Monika, you grew Salesforce massively, 7,000, 70,000, and now last few years, actually, you've been driving BMC. What are your best practices around navigating D&I in actually very different environments?
Yeah, very different environment. So Salesforce was a very high growth environment. I was there during a very rapid growth period of time. We were hiring 5,000 people a year. And D&I there looks very different because you have the benefit of volume on your side. At BMC, we've been flat for the last 4 years. We're private equity owned. We're doing portfolio distribution. So, you know, the headcount is going from here to there and in different places as we turn around the company. And so the D&I strategy has to be very, very different because you have no hiring volume to speak of to really help with your goals, whatever your metrics and goals might be. So we've had to take a very different approach, which one of the things I love about constraints is it makes you very creative. You know, as you might guess, going from Salesforce where, you know, profits are not the objective, which means that the expense budgets are really quite fantastic, to going into a private equity where it's all about EBITDA and free cash flow, so the cost pressure is extremely real. And yet I find that we're almost more creative now because of those constraints, and we have to be very focused. So I would not have expected that, and so that's been really interesting. So I'm happy to share what we've done in that constrained environment. So what's also unique about our company is that we have more employees outside the U.S. than in the U.S. We operate in 30 different countries, and it's interesting going from a very San Francisco-centric company run by a Jewish Buddhist to a very global company in Houston, Texas, or headquartered in Houston, Texas. So the mind shift is very, very different in every way. And what we decided we would do is we would have to differentiate. BMC Software is not a known brand. You know, Uber is a known brand. Salesforce is a known brand. Google, Facebook, and yet we draw talent from these companies. So we quickly had to figure out what was what I call an ownable position. What was something we could own? How could we differentiate? Because we're going to have to work that much harder to attract the candidate and to land the candidate. So what we decided was one way in which we would differentiate is to allow individuals to work wherever they want. And to start with the idea that, yes, you can work from wherever you are, the Ukraine, Kansas, wherever that might be. And we knew that when we dial up the hiring, that if we can go to where the talent is, where the women are, where people of color are, we believe that we will again differentiate in the employment by virtue of our results, so that we're not expecting that we can achieve diversity here in San Francisco by getting somehow, miraculously more women and people of color all of a sudden after 20 years of trying to San Francisco, California. And so we're flat right now, so we don't have volume on our side, but that strategy is now laid. We have a lot of technology that enables us to do that. We have a mindset and a corporate culture that allows us to do that. The executive team is all remote, so we lead from the top. So you don't feel like you are the odd man out when you are in Kansas. You know, I work out of a WeWork in Oakland, for example. So that will talk to me in a year, and I'll give you the stats on how that works. But that's our
Very,
strategy.
very interesting.
Yeah.
So Ashutosh, you have this poster here, and you say this often now, that humans are biased, right? And if you're not masking your candidate data, you're perpetuating bias. So although you're a machine learning expert, you've also become an expert on the human brain. So tell us a little more about what do you mean by humans are biased?
That's an interesting question, and like over the years, as I've been building teams, talking with the folks, right, and trying to understand like diversity, everyone is talking about it, right? We talk about conscious biases, subconscious biases. I mean, we talk about Hillary Clinton, right? The first thing we talk about is about her gender. Her gender has nothing to do with the work she does. You meet a candidate, the person, you take a resume, right? You read their name. The first thing that comes to our mind is what is their gender, what is their race. Like what I tell people is that 20 years from now, if someone were to ask you that you were in this panel discussion, you may not remember the name, you may not remember anything else, but you will remember the gender, the race, the build, the height of that person, whether the person was of color or not. You will remember that stuff, right? And that is what I mean by bias. We observe things, we as a human being, we are trained to observe things that at times have nothing to do with what we are talking to the individual about. So, and that is how we are wired, right? So what we did with some of our customers is, customers came back to us saying that, you know, we have these biases in our organization. We did the analytics, we measured that there were clear biases in the review process, the screening process. Now what can we do about it, right? And in some cases, the bias was as high as 50%. Like they will prefer the one gender 50% more times than the other gender for the same position with the same qualification. Now it could be the gender bias, it could be the age bias, it could be the ethnicity bias, any of those, right? It could be even a simple bias which is as simple but interesting as Stanford versus MIT. Like, I mean, some of the folks over here from Berkeley, right? They will be like Berkeley versus Stanford. And it doesn't matter, right? But that is the bias that we talk about, right? So what we did was, anytime you're reviewing a profile, right, of a candidate, it could be an internal employee actually. Why do you care about their name? Why do you care about their gender? Why do you care about their age? Why do you care about their race? Can I mask and anonymize all of that stuff? And while it sounds obvious at that point, but literally the bias went away from that 50% to 0%. So this is an example where technology can fundamentally help in helping us do the work properly and get around our bias.
Great. So Carmen, last time we talked, you had said that habits are algorithms the brain uses to save energy, right? So to some extent, our biases and prejudices are habits.
For sure.
So how do we break the habit?
How do you break the habit? I like that you still remember the quote. I was mentioning this notion of energy because if you think about it, anything that you do or your employees do or your audiences in general do is so much driven by how much energy you have left in your body to perform that motion. In fact, since we're talking about the brain, do you ever wonder why we have a brain? Why do human beings have a brain?
Don't know.
Take some guesses. To protect ourselves, to predict the future. I like where you're going. Anyone else? To think in some, hopefully more often than not. To tell us, ooh, I like how now we're getting philosophical and deep. I love this. And all of your answers are correct, but at the very basis of it all, the only reason why human beings have a brain is so we can move. And even though the brain hasn't changed much in the past 40,000 years, what has changed is our option in movement. These days we can move this way, we can move that way, we can take Uber or take some other means of transport. We have a lot of choices. The brain can move in many directions. And there's no movement that the brain makes unless there's memory involved. All of your movement, all of your choices, even you coming here tonight, is a choice, it's movement that you have made, and you have expanded energy based on what you remember, not on what you forgot. So your memories are serving you well because you're here at a good event like this. But in that movement, the brain expands a lot of energy, and any chance that the brain finds to conserve energy, it will take it, which is why people fall asleep in presentations. Any occasion you find to conserve energy, you'll take it, which is why we enjoy and we indulge in our habits so much, because they help us conserve energy. Whenever you engage in any habits, that means you don't have to expand a lot of cognitive energy. So that's why biases feel so juicy to the brain. Stereotypes feel so juicy to the brain because it's so easy to reach, so easy to go there. And I like what you're saying about masking some things, because sometimes technology can save us from our own brains. There was a movie a while back with Jodie Foster where she was asked, what would she do if she had the chance to meet some higher intelligence, some aliens? And what would be some questions that she would ask? And she said, I would ask them how to teach us to not destroy ourselves with technology. So I like that you're using it for the greater good, because you're right, every single moment that the brain engages in something, it's a choice. And choice by itself is bias. But what is bias but an inclination towards something? So we're building these habits, and now the question is, how do we break them? Not the easiest proposition. When was the last time that you broke one of your habits? Think about dieting or exercising more or traveling more or being more adventurous. If we look at science, what is it that we're learning in terms of deconstructing or breaking out some of the habits? Very often the answer is linked to how much exposure do we have for something. Imagine this, let's just say that we take some rats and you teach them to press a lever, and as a result they get some food. And that food is fairly scarce at the beginning. So the rat learns this habit, and that's nice because it's now correlated to a reward. And after a while, you devalue the food in the sense of you can press the lever and then you can get as much food as you possibly want, or you press the lever, but now you get some food that has been devalued in the sense that it has been injected with some bacteria and makes you really feel sick. How long does it take for the rat to realize that, wait a second, I shouldn't probably go for the food that makes me sick? Do I choose based on past satisfaction, or do I choose based on consequences? And the answer has to do with the amount of exposure. For the rats that have only gotten training for about 5 sessions, half an hour each, so that when they press the lever, they receive the food, those rats are easy to break the habits. But for rats that have gotten more than 20 hours of training, they keep going and going like this and like this and like this. So as you reflect on your own organizations, ask how much amount of exposure have people gotten in a specific area, and if there is a lot, then wonder step number 2, where can I drive their attention? Because you can only break bias if you're in charge of where the brain is looking. And why is that? Because attention paves the way to memory, and if you have memory, you have behavioral change, you have decision making.
Fantastic. Thank you. So Elle, you grew up in UK, and you moved to US a few years ago. You recently got your green card. Congratulations.
Thank you.
I think you got the last green card to be issued by the current administration.
Possibly.
Yeah, I'm sure. In your young career, what have you experienced regarding bias?
So I think when I first entered the workplace, it quickly became apparent that the office was a predominantly male environment. And as I looked around, certainly the leadership positions were occupied by men. And I think as I've, scaled with the company, grown with my career, become, acquired more business acumen, as I'm sure, most of us have experienced, even when you're sat in the room and you have something to say, people look towards the gentleman in the room to either validate you or repeat what you've said and, say it in a different way, and all of a sudden they'll start nodding. But, it's definitely challenging. I think I look up to strong female mentors, and I wish there were more of them. I wish there were more female leaders, but I think that I'm really interested in fighting for that change, and we'll continue to work at it.
Fantastic. So we've just completed a recent survey. It'll get published in a couple of weeks. And this was targeted at about 1,000 CEOs and CHROs. So 50% of them said that they want to hire more younger people but are struggling to get there. So in your organization, let's start with Monika. What are you doing to actually make BMC an attractive destination for the younger generation?
So this is a really important question because I think what I see in the industry, I'll enter industry first, as someone who's been a CHRO for a long time and in HR for over 30 years at this point. You're too kind, I know I look way too young for that. I think what we have to be careful of is to not over-rotate it has to be perfect for the millennials or next the iGen. I think what I would recommend and what we certainly do at BMC is make sure that it's a mutual contract, that it works for everyone. And what we have that's unique, very unique in the marketplace for talent is we hire millennials, 23-year-olds, and we also in our mainframe business have 70-year-olds who are engineers at BMC. And so we have this incredible age diversity that's happening all across the globe. But specifically to answer, what are we doing for the millennials? So it comes back a little bit to this theory, this point of view that we have around why it needs to be different to work in your company and at our company in particular. And what we took our cues from was, well, what's working in industry? And I'll use Uber as an example because Bernard is sitting right here and I'm a big Uber fan, 4.93 rating, by the way.
Nice.
These consumer apps have really transformed our lives, our personal lives. They're mobile first, they're easy. You never go to a YouTube video and say, well, how should I handle my Uber trip? If it's not intuitive, you won't use it. And so we have all this great disruption that's making us hugely productive and that these millennials are native to. And yet, if you think about your own company and the experience of working inside your organization, it does not feel that way. You're not using app-based processes, you are not using modern words, you're not leveraging technology to drive experiences and processes, by and large, I'm generalizing. And so this too is an area where we said, well, we can really differentiate. So we really need to up our game so that we can create an environment where once we get these young people in, they're delighted by this experience. I think what's about to happen is, that's all great. Very soon, these young applicants will reject your experience if it does not look like that. Today, they're going to be somewhat forgiving because they want a job. Tomorrow, they're going to be very discerning and they will just flat out say, I will not. If your hiring experience wasn't what I expected, and it wasn't modern, and it wasn't app-based, and you weren't pushing me content, and everything wasn't digital, and you didn't have all my data because you got it, I got to input it instead of sitting with an HR person, they'll reject that experience. So.
Interesting. Ashutosh, you've been in some of the biggest companies out there, Google, and then you had your own startup. What has your experience been in actually finding that balance or being attractive?
So it starts by thinking holistically about the problem. As Monika has mentioned, right? You have to provide the right experience for the folks. And what I have seen is that biases are on both sides. One is if you are under 25, it's very hard to find a job. And if you are above 45, then also it's extremely hard to find a job. So it could be on either side of the axis. Very simple thing is that, like as we are working with a number of enterprises right now, they're like, we don't want to hire someone until and unless you have 7 years of experience. Why? Because 7 is a good number. Everyone has talked about 5-7 years of experience, so let's pick that, right? But what you have suddenly done is someone who has 2 years of experience but is totally capable, they won't come. So if you go and look at the job descriptions in most companies, that is what you will struggle with, right? Or what they will do is they will list every possible skill known under the sun that I need everything for this job. Well, no one can acquire all those skills in 5 years, right? So those simple things at the top of the funnel when you are looking at bringing the people on board, right? I mean, you don't focus on that. Then when you're meeting someone, and if someone is not dressed the way you want them, like, actually it was kind of funny that when I was interviewing at IBM back in the days, right? One of the interviewers was like, how come you're not wearing a suit? Like, people sometimes are stuck in that mode that, okay, I expect people to wear a suit and tie and all kind of things, right? Again, what you're doing is biasing against the younger generation, where people are like, it's all about my work, what I do, not how I look and dress, unless my job really requires that. to then providing them an experience, like whether it is the app-based experience, whether digital experience. Most of us, I would put myself in that bucket that we are ADD. But then at the same time, if I apply to a company, I don't hear back for 4 weeks, I'm not going to have that good experience. So people want quick turnaround. So you have to think holistically. And even when you hire someone, just because this is a true story that in one of the companies I was, there was this person, he was performing extremely well. So okay, let's promote that person, right? But then the struggle was, no, but this person has only 1 or 2 years of experience. How can you promote them? And then the flip side is, no, but the person is performing, so why aren't we promoting that person, right? So sometimes we held back people, even though they are capable, they are doing the work, they're working hard, just because they look too young. So I think one has to think holistically and fight each of those things.
We're talking about attracting talent or attracting people that make you then advance in some way towards in front of your customers and get them to move towards you. And I love what you're saying, because essentially we attract those whose mental models we match. Because if we're talking about biases, what is a bias but also a mental model? But what do I mean by this? Whenever we're exposed to our reality, the brain starts building scripts or templates. We can also call those biases, through which we process everything that we experience. It will be exhausting for all of us right now to experience everything as if it was new all the time. You have a mental model for when you come to an event like this. You have a mental model for when you go to the airport. You have a mental model for when you go to the grocery store. Do you ever go to the grocery store and they switch things on you? Mm-hmm. It's crazy, isn't it? Especially if you go after a full evening or after a full day at work. But then now the brain is a cognitively lazy organ, given the chance to think or not to think. We'd rather not think. So of course you expect the eggs to be in a specific spot. You expect somebody to wear a suit. So one way to attract the talent that serves you well is to at least initially match a mental model. So perhaps could we consider that biases have some benefits, because when you hook into somebody's existing model, that means you're not making them think so much. And the decision to move is that much easier. We just love going towards that which we already know. And your attention is already expanded for that which you already know. Do you ever buy a car and suddenly everybody on the highway drives the same damn car that you just bought? Yeah. And it's not that all of a sudden there are more of those cars, but your attention has expanded for that which you already know. However, after a while, if we allow the brain to habituate too much, or if we feed its biases and its mental models, things become too boring. That's why people switch jobs so frequently. Now we're ready for something that's a bit more surprising. So can you, in whatever you do, have a good balance between the familiar and the habit or a bias with a twist? I'll give you an example. Since we're talking about Facebook, there was a bookstore in Israel, and what they did very well is, just like any bookstore, what do they want? They want people to move towards their store and buy books. And their ad had the typical Facebook banner. Everybody has the mental model already for the blue background and the white letters that say Facebook. But in the middle of the word, they inserted the letter A. So now it said face a book. See, they're very easily managing something that the brain finds familiar with a slight twist. So can you play off of the mental model that your audiences already have?
It's a brilliant strategy. You know, I think about, as you were speaking, I think about like TV shows they reboot. You know, it'll work again. Mm-hmm. When people bring back a song that's like 20 years old and they play it again for another generation, of course it'll play again because it worked so well the first time. It's just really fascinating. And also what I think is interesting about it, we're also trying to affirm our existence. So let's say I went to Harvard and I look at a hiring profile, I'm like, a Harvard man, clearly is good. I want to affirm how great I think of myself, and anyone who went to that school for that matter.
Did you go to Harvard?
I did not. It's just the example I'm using. But I remember when I first became HR director many years ago, there was a woman who went to the same school that I went to. So I went to Hampton University for undergrad, and then she went to Trinity for grad school, and she had the exact same credential. I said, certainly she's going to be great. Because I was affirming myself. It wasn't that she was great, but that she could have been terrible. And the point I'm trying to make is I was affirming my sense of self as opposed to that person's credentials, which had nothing to do with their school. What we should be doing is measuring for competencies and what they'll bring to the table, as opposed to finding someone who's like me, because otherwise you're just hiring for comfort.
Can I make a comment about what Ashutosh is talking about, specifically this this idea of eliminating some of the representative features that we come to you. You didn't wear a
hold
suit.
your mic.
Oh, sorry. Does that help?
Yep.
Sorry. Wow, I'm never accused of being quiet, so okay, sorry about that. Sorry for all of you who couldn't hear. My comment was about when Ashutosh was talking about, going to IBM, he didn't wear a suit and they called it out. And I think a lot in terms of mutuality, mutual between the company's contract with the employee and then also the employee's contract with the company. And I think this is top of mind because we do hire so many young people, and I have a 28 and a 24-year-old who both have jobs, thank God. But I do think that there is a responsibility for a mutual acceptance of what that bias or expectation should be. So I think it's incumbent upon us as the employer, for example, to make sure that they're prepared. If not wearing a suit is going to set you back, then we should tell you that, and then you can decide. But if you don't know and you're flying blind, and then, so we didn't say that was a social norm or an expectation at BMC, for an example, well, that's shame on us, because then we're leaving it to chance, and then our bias will show. So I just wanted to comment that I think it's really important. And I commented only because I get from so many managers, and I'm sure you hear this too, where it feels like it's so one way. We all have to change, and we all have to be more like this iGen or these young people. And I do think there is a lot of truth in that. Yes, we are constantly evolving. The contract is constantly evolving. We need to evolve as employers. But I also think that there should be an expectation. I think it shows respect early on in the process. And I just wanted to make that comment that only because so many people get frustrated and say it's all this one way, and I really don't think it is, and I don't think it has to be.
That's a great
I
point.
agree with that.
So as you hear all this, from your perspective, next time you're looking for a job or you want your current employer to do something different, what would be your criteria to say, okay, yeah, this is the place I want to be?
So I think social impact is really important. I definitely look to passionate social activists like Benioff, and I follow his Twitter account religiously, and he's bravely, despite what kind of reactions it might have to his customer base, is very, very strong about his beliefs with gender parity and gay rights and a number of other topics. And I think millennials really care about working for a company that is honest, for leaders that they can trust, and for a company that is using their platform and their wealth and their reach for the greater good. So I think that's number one for me.
What else?
I think companies that are upfront about how they will support your career development and your growth. It's quite easy for that to get lost in smaller companies when everything's very busy, and at a larger company you have an obligation to young people to make sure that they are getting the opportunities that they deserve and the mentorship that they need to progress. And I think that's key also.
Excellent. So Bernard, you've been at Uber a year and a half or so. What are the changes that you see, either through some of your efforts or otherwise, just as the readiness evolves in that organization?
That's a great question. The good thing about all of our multiple inflection points of last year and even to date is that sunshine is the best antiseptic. So each time one of those things happens, we could have a microscope and look at what do we need to address and how do we fix it. When before, I think we were just more focused on growth, market share, and just getting the Uber brand out there. So what we find ourselves in, after a couple of earlier things that happened in 2017, we basically had to take a wholesale look at ourselves and what practices should we change and what should we look at. And it was almost, from an HR standpoint, from a diversity and inclusion standpoint, largely about, we actually talked to all our staff. We did lots of focus groups, we did listening sessions, but what would you like to see in your organization? Because if you're going to right size it, ask the folks what they want, what do they need? People wanted a better performance review system. People wanted pay equity in aggregate. People wanted diversity and inclusion to be important. They wanted our values to change. They wanted us to release the diversity data. So basically we want to do everything different. And you just started with, I think the main thing is getting buy-in from your staff and making sure you really understand what they need to thrive. Everything that you said, what is important to the staff, why would anyone stay? Because we have to think about the employee value proposition. But to your question, what are the things that we changed? What were the things that were changed? First, we did our employee resource groups. They grew dramatically. They went from about 2,000 people last year, and now we have over 7,000 people. So we use them as our, what I call the canaries in the coal mine. We did our first employee resource group summit last year. We flew everybody in, like, what do? We tested out our Why Diversity Matters training, which was a training we've taken globally throughout the company. We trained over 4,000 people. We changed our job descriptions because we lost people at hello. People would go and say, a fierce competitor and super aggressive this and that. It's like, no thanks. So we used this service called, they've changed names several times, but they're like Textio, but basically scrub it and tell you why, they give you a score as to why your job description is not very savory. We did the end-to-end hiring processes. Like, we have an intake form to make sure people get measured against competencies as opposed to nice to haves. There's so many things. We have a diversity advisory council. We have a better representation on our board. Like, you have to, I think when you have moments like that, you have to change, otherwise you'll be destroyed. And so I think thankfully, we happened before certain movements that occurred that allowed us to actually take wholesale and be really honest about what we needed to change, and then put in the right leaders in place. We have a great CEO, and we have a great chief legal officer, and we've made really key pivotal hires to help us move that, and then you can model and mirror those folks, because they're doing the right things, and it makes it easier when you see someone doing the right thing to follow that. Because I think sometimes, I always call it like the 15, 15, and 70 rule. Like 70% of us are the herd, there's 50% of people who are like probably not so great, and the other 50 people are great. And they're looking at the people, whoever the dominant party is, like, who should I follow? And I think we have the positive, aspirational 15% at the helm, helping drive us in that direction of positivity. And we're gonna have stumbles, but I think day by day we take wholesale looks at ourselves and say, like, what should we be doing? What should we be doing better? And we just keep pushing forward, keep hiring good people.
So over a period of 18 months, as some of these changes are now seeping in, do you think that growth has slowed down? Has it had an impact on the business one way or the other?
Growth still grows. Can I even say that? All right, so I was employed 11,500. We have about 20,000 employees. And so the good thing is we're getting people coming in the door. So we have something called Uberversity. So that's like your new hire orientation. But I'm going to be presenting on Thursday. It's called Inclusion at Uber. So that way you understand from day one what inclusion looks like at Uber. And that's when we expose you to the 16 employee resource groups that we have. So that way you know at least what's the baseline of how Uber operates. Our chief diversity officer presented the D&I plan to the whole company today. And we're going to give them updates and progress. Because the main thing people need to think about is, and everyone's kind of touching this, everyone's in a different place in their journey. And you can't expect everyone to catch up. Like, if I'm the fastest runner ever, I can't expect you all to run as fast as me. Everyone starts at a different point, and you have to bring everyone along. And if you can't give them a general sensibility on how you operate, then it's a failing endeavor. So it's basically just baselining. This is what it is, and constantly educating folks. Yeah.
Interesting. So outside your own organizations, give me an example of someone that you think, organization or folks, group of people who are doing it right. May not be there, but are actually making some of the right strides.
I think looking at Uber a year ago and the company culture, the things that were in the news, it was such an unappealing company to even consider applying for. And kind of going back to what I was saying before about people wanting to work for people that they trust, and that even if they're not doing everything right now, they're honest about their path and their journey and what they're trying to fix. I noticed even an email this week from Uber that I'd received saying, hey, we know we were a bit of a mess. We're figuring it out. These are the changes that we've put in place, and being honest about their progress, and it shows that they're giving it that focus and they're prioritizing it. And just through that honesty, Uber becomes a much more appealing place to work, because you then want to be a part of that change and that growth in the company too. as it moves towards being a better company.
Okay. Who do you think is doing it right in the D&I field? Who do you like?
I think what I've been super excited about, it's not just one company.
Mm-hmm.
So, like last week, I was on a trip to India and met probably 10 companies over there. And like quite a few times people ask me like, is this D&I just a lip service? Is it a PR thing? And what was fascinating is to talking to these companies, and everyone was very genuinely thinking about it. Everyone is trying to do the right thing. It's no longer about just being a lip service. Let me figure it out. What is the right thing? How do I do it? Like not naming the individual, right? There was this head of HR I was talking to, and I told him about the masking. And like after 5 minutes, once he get it, he was like, Ashu, this is just interesting because I think in my organization, I don't have biases just with the hiring managers, but also in my recruiting team. And personally, I am biased. So if you're above 35, I don't hire. And I have my biases between North India and South India. And I have biases against the college names. So I have all these biases. And even if I were to fight those, I will end up taking an affirmative action. That I will prefer one over the other, right? Which is not the right thing either. So if you can help me get around my biases, either you give me so much data, but that will take forever, the lifetime, or you can just remove the data that is not relevant and that is causing those biases, right? So that my lazy brain, as you're saying, right, can work around it. So to me, that was fascinating to hear that everyone is really talking about it and genuinely trying to solve it.
Great. How about you, Monika?
True to my brand, I'm going to answer a little bit differently. What I'd like to see is diversity and inclusion become more important at the board and CEO level. I think too often these companies deputize this issue to HR, which is wrong, and down in the organization. And that's not, it's not that they shouldn't do that, but they often only do that. And I really would like to see someone be really bold and make a statement and be very affirmative and competitive about a board level commitment to D&I and CEO pay level committed, ELT level committed to D&I. Because I find that, in my long career so far, we talk a lot about this topic. But the answers are not always difficult. Some of them are very difficult. And we're not as aggressive as I would like to see in this area in that way. So I'd like, I guess, to answer it somewhat differently. I think that's what it would be great to see that.
Great. How about you, Carmen?
We work with a lot of organizations and teach them brain science workshops so that they understand a little bit more how the brain works and how they can leave memories in somebody else's brain so that they convince them to move in their favor. And I'm noticing that people who do things well, those who aspire at being memorable, but also know what they want to be memorable for. So if you have any kind of diversity and inclusion messages, or any other message for that matter, and you want it to reside on somebody else's brain long term, first of all, have the clarity of that message. Second of all, make sure that that message comes to the brain easily. Since we're looking at the brain as a cognitively lazy organ, and there is no easy way of putting it, it goes without saying that the more easily your message is activated later on when you're not even in the room, then you have an increased chance. For example, we were working with a technology client and I was asking them, so what message should your audiences remember about you? And they were saying, we love for our customers to remember that our technology is modularly versatile. And we're saying, dude, nobody talks that way. There's just no way that you'd sit down at dinner and say, we have got to buy that technology because it's so modularly versatile. So just make sure that when you want to convince people to move in your favor and you have eliminated some of these biases, those messages come to mind easily. And the third recommendation I would have is the brain will move in your favor, regardless where that brain comes from and beyond its demographics, if you know what's rewarding to that brain. Quite often we will expand the energy if we know that the reward is worthwhile. And often people don't make decisions in our favor because we have not clarified the reward, or the reward is so wishy-washy, we don't even know why we should move that way. Do you know what's rewarding to your audience's brains? I know that a few of you here are from UC Berkeley. There was an experiment that was done at Berkeley in the 1940s by a scientist by the name of Otto Tinklepaw. Imagine that being your name. So Mr. Otto Tinklepaw would do this experiment where he would have a monkey in a room, and the monkey would observe the experiment, hide a piece of lettuce under one of two cups. And the researcher would be very curious to know how long would it take the monkey to go out of the room, come back into the room, and go directly to the cup where the lettuce was hidden. On average, it would take the monkey about 2 minutes to go outside, come back, find the lettuce very quickly, and eat it because the monkey would find it very rewarding. So he would repeat this experiment for about 2 months, and then in one of the sessions, he changed things a bit. So the monkey comes back into the room, goes to the cup where he thinks he's going to find the lettuce, and now he finds a banana. And he's also excited because obviously given the choice of rewards, he prefers that second one. And now he repeats this experiment for another 2 months where each time the researcher is hiding a banana. And after another 2 months, Mr. Otto Tinklepaw does something mean. In one of the sessions when the monkey comes back into the room, goes to the cup where he's thinking he's going to find the lettuce, the banana, and what does he find? He finds the lettuce. So he gets very, very angry. He starts being aggressive with the chair, then being aggressive with the researcher, and leaves the room not touching the lettuce, which, remember, months before was very rewarding to its brain. So as you're reflecting on your own strategies, are you giving your audiences lettuce when they expect bananas? Because the brain will go toward the bigger reward and will expand the energy in favor of the bigger reward.
Profound. I agree. I think in terms of people who do, I admire a lot of people within the D&I community, and I see them all do bits and pieces really, really well. But I think it's largely dictated by their environment. Some companies will allow you to do certain things or give you the autonomy and space to operate, and certain things, I think, play to those strengths. Like I really admire Pinterest, but I think Pinterest is a unique environment where a lot of those things can take hold. I also think, to everyone else's point on the panel, it's about the employee value proposition, and why would I want to work in your company? And so there's something I always call, and I think this is just another way of saying what you said, the see-say problem. Am I seeing what you're saying? So the two have to match up, because a lot of times we have a beautiful website and it touts all these things, but when you get inside, it's unlike anything that was presented to you, which is very disappointing, because now, like, you told me I was getting a banana, now there's lettuce. And that's just like, now I'm here. And so if you had just been more transparent with me and been honest with me, I would have stayed. But because you kind of did the whole okey doke and switched the two, that's why people leave. They go like, this is not what you told me, that you're not telling the truth, and I'm leaving. And then, how much money did you put into bringing that candidate, maybe relocated them, maybe there's some training, and now they walk out the door. And maybe attrition usually happens in 8 months, but now it happened in 2. So you lost just by not being transparent as an organization. So I think organizations allow D&I professionals to either be really great in certain areas because of the structures that they give them. But I think overall, we're all doing bits and pieces really well, but we're also operating within the constraints of our company's readiness to let us operate.
Interesting. So Monika, your title now is Chief Employee Experience Officer. So what made you rethink what your responsibility was and what did you want to change in the organization? Because it was first time I heard that title was from you, but now I'm seeing that in other organizations also. Airbnb, she has the same title. So what's driving that change?
For us, it came from a point of view, which
It
came from a point of view, and that is that we admired how most companies, including our companies, really focus on the customer. And they build ecosystems and back end around the customer so that the customer has a better experience or a great experience, a single throat to choke or whatever you want to call it. And yet these same companies don't always have a strategy that looks at the employee at the center of that universe. So as I said earlier, typically we face broken processes or inconsistent experiences. Maybe your IT experience is fantastic, but your HR experience is terrible. And yet it's all your own company. It's one company. And then I guess the last part would be it's really rare to find a company that holds itself accountable to that. You know, are there individual CSAT scores, internal CSAT scores, or NPS scores, or do managers get rated, you know, if they're a back office function and how happy they made the employees, or how quickly issues were resolved? And the answer is pretty much we don't do that. So our theory was to build an employee experience organization that held ourselves accountable to those experiences across the board. So our team is responsible from everything having to do with onboarding, IT provisioning, hiring, performance management, real estate facilities management, security, travel, and all communications. So we felt that we could then shield the employee from all the sausage making and all the different processes, different sign-ons, different engagement, and pull it all together. And we're not done. We're on that, you know, we're still on that path. But so far, the early reads are, it completely has changed the mindset of everybody who works in employee experience, because they know that they're accountable to those metrics and those measures. And some of the next step we'll take is to add cognitive capabilities and AI to actually see experiences that are data-driven. So for example, if you are a hiring manager, we all know that we disappoint employees very much in the hiring process. Their phone wasn't ready, they didn't know where they were going to sit, maybe they didn't get the laptop provisioned as they wanted, whatever. And now we can tell by virtue of automated process, did the manager do what we need them to do 10 days out? And if they didn't, we can insert ourselves and say, you're about to have a shitty employee experience. Is that what you want, Mr. and Ms. Manager? Otherwise, you need to go and do these 3 things. And then we can do that again in T-5 days. Same thing with the employee. Maybe the employee has not completed something that we asked them to do. We can insert ourselves. So it's all about rethinking the process so that you have a good experience. I think the way I like to think about it is 5 or so years ago, there was this big push to automated shared services. Those were all driven by finance. It was to reduce cost. It was not wrong, but it had no consideration for how it made people feel. Back to the Maya Angelou quote, it's not what you do, it's how you made someone feel. So what we're trying to do is take that process and that strategy and also now hold ourselves accountable to how that person felt. What was the satisfaction score that you would give us in that interaction?
Great. So a couple more questions, then we'll open up to the audience. Mary, can you get the mic from the back? So let's talk about ageism. We touched upon it briefly. It's rampant in all industries, especially in tech, especially in Bay Area, right? And we had that lunch when we were talking about it, that the chances of a 50-year-old, no, not for me, for you to roam around. The chances of some 50-year-old white American software engineer being hired by one of the larger employers in Bay Area is between 0 and none. I think the challenge there is on both sides, both on the employer side as well as on the individual side. And some of it is simply, I think there's also things are changing. The half-life of skills is really 5 to 7 years. So you have to keep staying relevant and attractive and indispensable in the workforce. So there are a couple of aspects here. One is from the individual side, that how do you stay in that learning mode? And to your point, you do become lazy over a period of time. How do you actually shed that laziness or inertia? And on the employer side, how do you actually make this thing work? Because where it's exacerbated today is retention. You can't just keep getting rid of people to get a different set in, because in some cases there just aren't enough out there. So what do you guys think about that? What do you think we need to do to actually improve the situation with ageism?
I think there's a perception issue. When I was in the Hillary campaign, Eric Schmidt came and talked to us. And he was telling us, I think, about Steve Jobs, and he was saying he doesn't hire certain people over a certain age because they can't innovate. And I thought I was kind of floored that he would say that, because that can't be true. And so the more I think about that, I think if you're going to stay on top of your game or stay competitive, I think, you should have a general curiosity, I think, to want to improve your craft. You just can't say, I graduated from MIT, when? 1950. If you haven't gone back to school or done anything to get some accreditation or things that keep you sharp, I mean, you're out of practice. So I think it's really important that, when I was an HR director, there's a place called the Society for Human Resource Management, which is the society for HR professionals. And you have to go with certifying credits because new laws come out, new regulations come out. You have to stay sharp if you want to stay on top of HR is complex. A lot of people don't think that until there's an issue. But I think you should think about how you can keep certified. How can you stay relevant? So I think that is one way that if people are ageist, you could show that I have credentials. And I think within companies, if people gave, like competency ladders, and like this is where you need to go, do these 8 things, this could take it to the next level. So that way everyone knows you're kind of certified within your company as opposed to, I went to school, I've been in this job 20 years. So like after a point, like what have you done to improve yourself? So I think those are some ways you can help address it.
I agree with that, and I would add on that I'm going to use the word desire. A lot of times when we're placing an individual candidate, we're screening not only for the skill and qualification, but their desire. And I think what I've seen is that, unfortunately, as some people get older, we get more set in our ways. We lose our aspect of curiosity for new skills, but we also lose that aspect of, again, I'm going to call it desire. And the way desire shows up is that energy that someone younger has. Then maybe this is the innovative, comment where they're leaning into it, they're curious, they are energetic, and they're desirous of what it is you're talking about. They're desirous of the job. By the way, they're also going to come and tell you they want it. That's desire. And I think, unfortunately, what I see in some of the older technical individuals is they don't appear that way. They don't present that way, for whatever reason it may be. Some do, and those who do tend not to have the issue because they are mirroring the skills and the desire profile of some of that younger person. They love to tinker with new technology. They can't get their hands on it enough. They spend time with those teams that are already on the forefront of innovation. They transfer readily. They're raising their hand. They're acting like, you would have more of that, again, to generalize the younger set. But it's not an age thing at all. It's my word, desire. And so I don't know how we solve that because desire is very difficult to replicate. You either have it or you don't. But maybe you celebrate those success stories more because it's the exception.
Carmen.
We can add a formal framework to the answers that you both have offered, which are really good. So imagine that as you're investigating your own audience's brains, your potential employees, any customers or prospects, everything that they do is a function of their energy. And the energy that we have in our bodies, in our brains, are a matter of how much do we expand versus how much we bring in. How many hours of sleep did you get last night, by the way? Six-ish, 5-ish. So imagine often if we wonder, why is it that we don't have that desire? Because imagine 3 intersecting circles. It's your physical capacity, your cognitive capacity, and your emotional capacity that have to intersect just so the brain has enough energy to help us move. And one of the reasons we don't work so well as we get older in that physical capacity is because we either don't get enough sleep. So do all those things that your mother told you to do. Eat well, sleep enough, and get a little bit more exercise. Will have a lot more desire if we do. For the cognitive capacity, the more that we stay curious, as you mentioned, we will stay curious if the reward is strong enough, and the brain takes bribes. So if you want to focus a bit more on learning or relearning a few things, wonder what's the reward for my own brain? Because when the reward is clear, we have specific areas in our brains that get activated, our reward system does, and that's laden by this neurotransmitter that I'm sure every single person here in this room knows about, which is dopamine. Dopamine is one of those chemicals that have been so studied and overly studied to the point where we're calling it the Kim Kardashian of neurotransmitters. But we used to know about dopamine that it was related to something that you liked and you craved. Tell me something that you like and you crave constantly.
Chocolate.
Chocolate is a prevalent answer, but the neurofinding that we have from neuroscience is this: you don't have to have dopamine in your brain to like chocolate. You have to have dopamine in your brain to go get it. So the more we have that chemical in there, the more we're likely to have the drive and the desire to move towards that object or towards that place. How do we activate dopamine? By clarifying the reward. And that works for both the cognitive and the emotional aspect. So find the right intersection between physical, emotional, and cognitive capacity for you or your employees, and you're more likely to get them to move towards you.
So you gave simple examples for rats and monkeys and a complex one for humans.
Yeah, true.
Ashutosh, what do you think?
So very interesting question, and I will share one of my personal biases that I have seen. So kind of 2-3 examples, right, and then I will dive in. One is that when I started my previous company, I was in my early 30s. And at that time when I was hiring people, right, building a team, I used to think that if you're in early 40s, you're old. 10 years later, when I started this new company, I think if you're in 30s, you're young, and 40s is fine. My own thinking changed. Second thing is that some of you guys might have read the book Laszlo wrote about Google hiring work rules. One thing he has mentioned over there is that at Google, when they did this experiment, they discovered that people decide whether they are going to hire someone or not in the first 30 seconds. What you're really looking at in first 30 seconds is just the biases you're talking about, right? From my own experience, most of the time, actually I have this strong thesis that most of us, at least me, I'm not qualified to interview someone and evaluate them in 45 minutes or 1 hour, whether they are good for the job or not. I can do fact checking, I can look for red flags, I can just verify certain things, but I can't evaluate their life's work in 45 minutes. I'm not that good, right? So what happens when you walk into the interview? Even before we are walking into the interview, we have already made up our mind whether we are going to hire this person or not. And then we're just kind of evaluating that over there and verifying that. Now what happens is that if someone, we look at their profile and we see that they are 50-year-old, we just assume that they won't have desire. We just assume that they won't have energy. We assume that they won't be abreast with the latest technology. We just assume all those things. And then we walk into the interview room. Oh yeah, of course you don't have any of those things, right? We are looking for signals to verify that they don't have those things. Versus when you're walking into the room, we are looking for signals to verify whether they have those desires. So what you have to do is think about that holistically again. Is in my organization, let's say I'm building an interview panel, do I have enough people with that age diversity so that I can verify for that? I won't have those biases, right? When I'm walking into the interview room, right, do I even need to know this person's age and gender? If I don't, I'm walking in with a very open mind versus I'm walking with the mind which is already biased, right? So if you, and that what it starts to do is gives you the exposure. Like, I mean, the simple thing is, right, for the software engineer, we are assuming that he or she may not be able to do it, right? But for our parents, we are like, no, they can do it. Like, they have all this energy. Like in this room, we have people of all the age and we feel like, yeah, we can do the work, right? So it's not as much about like whether they can do it or not. And like the thing that we talk about, like working hard versus working smart, right? Like some of the best software engineers at Google that I worked with, right? I mean, are in that age group. So, but because that number is so small, we just assume that they cannot do it, right? Like Jeff Dean, who is probably the most famous software engineer in the Silicon Valley, right, is in that age group. So is Sanjay Ghemawat, so is all the top engineers over there, right? So how do we, one is more exposure, one is the right setup, removing the biases. I think that can go a long way.
Fantastic. So I have a couple of other questions, but before we run out of time, any questions from the audience? There's one back here, Maddie. At the back.
Thank you. Hi there. I'm currently with 23andMe, and one of the things that we're trying to work through on the diversity front right now is specifically with women in tech roles. So it looks like, I know this is a very common problem in the Valley, but the diversity stats match kind of the graduation rates for CS degrees. So as opposed to just 23andMe trying to go out and poach from other companies, how do we help as companies get more people at a much earlier stage when they're choosing their degrees to go into those CS degrees? It seems like that's really where we're going to get to the point, but as a company where we don't necessarily have that influence, we're not really sure where to start. So I'd love to hear any of your thoughts on how to get in front of that.
I'll take a crack at it. I think that that part of the problem Silicon Valley can solve in spades. And I'd really love to see some of the larger companies invest in the school systems and inviting women, young girls into these fields, but also showing them role models as to what success looks like. So it needs to be, I think, a full suite of investing in the school system such that there is the true education for STEM, which is not always prevalent, and then showing them that there is representation when they leave the schools or mentoring along the way. So I think we need to do a better job in industry of reaching out into those organizations and providing our skill sets with mentoring, with money, and then with a bridge to actually creating employment.
I have a suggestion from the brain science perspective. I like your idea about going a little bit earlier and catching them a little bit earlier. So let's just say that you get involved with high schools or colleges so that you know that more people get those degrees. And when you do, and if you get involved in that, then you might attract the attention of millennials because that's social impact that you're making. Just make sure that when you're making those messages and you're transmitting those messages, you match what they consider rewarding at that age. And I'll give you an example. For example, in a lot of high school and campuses, there are a lot of promotions on don't drink and drive. And those promotions initially were made with statistics and showing gory images of what happens when you drink and drive. And somebody just realized that they're not really that effective. And they changed those promotions to say, don't let your mom drive you to the prom. Because they realize that at that age, the reward for you is social image. That's what you're after. That's what will move you towards a specific decision. So clarify the messages from the standpoint of what that brain finds rewarding at that young age, and you'll have a much higher chance for people enrolling in the degrees that then will serve you well.
So let me add one more thing over there. One is that as you're building your own organization, right, and if you come across as very inclusive organization, right, like the role models that we heard a number of times today in the panel, right, like my spouse, she's an engineer as well. Now, what is the role model she is going to be to her kids, right, when they look at her, right? Many of our spouses, right, are females in the workforce. I mean, if they see that there's a very inclusive environment, they will be more comfortable for their kids to go into STEM. Versus if they feel that there's a very biased environment, I mean, they will fight back because the first thing starts over there. So I think that is something I think whatever we are doing over here will help a lot, go a long way in building that society. The second thing is when we talk about like those stats matching, one very interesting story is that in my undergrad, I went to IIT in India, right? And out of the batch of 300 people, 270 did not do computer science. They did civil engineering, mechanical engineering, manufacturing, textile, mining, all kind of things, but not computer science. But out of those 300 people, 295 probably are doing computer science today. So if you really look at the people who are capable of doing it versus they have just done it, then the set expands materially.
A great point.
Mm-hmm.
So we can do that as well.
Yeah, and if I might add, so and it's comprehensive. We have to have an altruistic mindset to know that if you make those early investments, because it's hard to go to your company and say, let's invest really early, but like they'll go, well, how many of them are going to come here? That's hard for a lot of people to conceptualize that. No, we're really actually investing in the pipeline versus like, what am I going to get tomorrow or the day after? And so it's a mindset shift, and that's for every company. Mm-hmm. I mean, because everyone knows this is the next frontier, and we all have to be more competitive. So we have to kind of shift that narrative. And even when I think back to when I was a little boy, I'd see girls like, and this is anecdotal, but girls would always raise their hand, and then teacher would eventually stop calling on her and go to the guy who didn't raise his hand. But like, we do things to demotivate people from wanting to aspire for more, because like I know if you keep raising your hand, you don't get called on, what are you going to do? To your point about being conditioned, I will not raise my hand anymore. And generally when I was in school, girls were always better.
Still are?
Still are.
Yeah, yeah.
And you know, but the thing is, we're not supporting and doing the things to make me wanting to keep raising my hand. And so like I have two daughters, and I hate when people say that, but like I am invested because I want my daughters to succeed. Like so as far that I've named my daughters gender neutral names. I try to do everything to give them every opportunity so no one will discriminate against them before they get a shot. Like they're Peyton and Bailey. Somebody might go, that's an awesome dude, you know, but the point is, do they have some edges to beat out the competition?
That's funny.
And I don't want them to be discouraged. I want them to be really encouraged and for them to always raise their hand. So you have to really go way, way back and just have this altruistic mindset about are we going to be competitive or not? And we have to make sure everyone has a fair shot at it.
I love it. Ooh.
Hold on.
Okay. I've also never been told I need a microphone. So one of the things, Carmen, that you said earlier that I'd love to learn a little bit more about and get the panel's view on is how difficult it is to break habits, especially the older we get or the more experience perhaps we have at certain things. But one of the benefits of that is pattern recognition.
Yes.
So how do you differentiate between breaking bad habits and pattern recognition that helps drive efficiencies?
Ooh, I love that phrase so much, the pattern recognition, because the brain is such a pattern-thirsty machine. One of the ways that we build habits is by starting to recognize patterns, and when we do, we don't have to think so much. That's why we see patterns even when there are none. That's why you see smiley faces in those sockets where you plug things in. Do you ever see smiley faces in those? This is why we see Jesus on tortillas and the Virgin Mary on toast. We see patterns even when there are none, because when we recognize one, we don't have to think so much. So as you're breaking habits, or let's think of it more in terms of building new habits. See, there is a difference to the brain when you're saying, I'm going to break a habit versus I'm going to build a new habit. Same with, there is a difference when you say, well, we're biased or we want more women in. Why even activate those words in the brain? Just don't even go there. Don't put your attention where it doesn't, it's not worthwhile to spend your energy. So think of it, first of all, refocus and say, I'm going to build a new habit that serves me well. The reward is this. And the repetition that I have to engage in is going to also be rewarding. Because there's no secret. The way that we build all these things is based on repetition. And there's a neuroscience around repetition, because there's a very fine line between something that you repeat and serves you well and something that now turns nagging or boring. Have you engaged in repetition that is just so downright boring? You have to have the reward that's strong enough that holds you through those glorious moments. One of the longest running shows in Broadway. What do you think it is, by the way?
Cats.
Cats is one. And there's another one.
Lion King?
Phantom of the Opera, somebody said yes. I was just reading an interview with the main person who has been starring in the Phantom of the Opera, and guess how many roles? Guess how many times he performed that role? 1,716 times that he had to repeat the same darn thing night after night. Imagine, after a while you get born of your own pattern recognition and your repetition. How do you do it? So the journalists were asking him the same question: how in the world can you stand that much repetition? And I really enjoyed his response. He says, you know, every 2 weeks we get a new Christine. And that's the leading role changes fairly frequently. So to him, that was enough variety to keep him engaged and to keep him rewarded. So through that pattern repetition, as you're building new habits, can you have enough variety that keeps you rewarded so that you have enough energy to dedicate to that new habit?
So, a question for you. How can AI help do some of these course corrections, especially in the context of work environment?
I like this question so much. So imagine this, especially since we're here near Santa Clara University. I was reading the story of this professor who took on this task of creating an opera. And these days, if you're a music teacher, creating an opera is not really the easiest task. But he was also a good computer programmer, so he thought, why don't I teach the machine to create an opera for me? What would I have to do in order for a computer to give me some Chopin-like tunes? And it took him 4 years, and finally he created the software to the point where he went one day for lunch, and while he was having his club sandwich, he came back to this machine that had created for him 5,000 Chopin-like tunes. And he was so excited, so now he's presenting his findings and his software in front of a community, very much like this, and at first he plays the song, and he allows people to feel the emotion behind that song. And everybody was thinking, well, surely this is human-based. And then he tells them, no, actually this was created by a computer. And the person, the gentleman sitting here in the front row, very much like you, got up and punched him in the face. He was so distraught that now the machine is taking over something that is just so inherently human, like creativity and emotion. So we have to be very cautious where we allow some of these AI instruments to come and help us. But the optimal one would be to take some things away that require so much energy from a human and that can be automated. So this way you can allow the brain to have a lot more energy. So let the robots create the songs, but you decide what you want them to sing about.
Interesting. What do you guys think? What can AI do to help D&I? Ashutosh, machine learning expert?
So I think so. What our attempt towards is that, like, instead of making people fight their biases, remove those biases from them. So don't even make them think about it, as you are
Or
saying.
pay attention.
Or pay
yes.
attention, right? And it can come in any form. Like another very interesting example is resume books. When you go to university campus recruiting, right, you get these resume books for 300, 500 resumes. And the data shows that once you start going through the 5th and 8th and 10th and 12th resume, you are no longer comparing the person to the job, you're comparing the person to the previous person. Because, I mean, and that becomes a huge cognitive overload. So can you take away all those tasks from the human being? So to me, humans are great in analyzing things. Memory-wise, machines are much, much better. So give all the memory-oriented tasks to machines. Take away these kind of biases and really help humans focus on what is relevant for the job.
I think today's resumes are pretty broken, and for AI to identify other key performance indicators, instead of someone just looking at, oh, you've been at a job for 5 years, you don't have the experience, to actually pick up on other things that show that you've progressed, that you've developed new skills, that you are actually applicable to that job description, that goes far beyond what you can put on a piece of paper. I think that's what AI needs to do to help the candidate and to help the company match the job description to the right person.
Fantastic.
I'd like to see AI also start to help us and contemplate psychometric capabilities that we know play out in the workforce once you've hired people, but they're very difficult to glean as you're hiring someone. And so I really hope for the day when we get a better sense of psychometric, so that we can see how teams will interact, how you can maximize teams based on corresponding correlative skills, not similarities, but differences coming together in the most powerful way. So I think I'm hopeful that that will come too.
Right. Anyone now?
I think it's an objective validator. I think it's an important tool to use as an input, because what I've found being in Silicon Valley is a lot of people don't believe diversity and inclusion is important, or they don't understand the significance of it. And I think AI can help in aiding people who need that validation, so that way they can then look at the data and I accept that the AI is true and the input and the data that comes out of it is true, therefore then I can then validate whatever the hypothesis is. So I think it helps in that regard. Otherwise, you know, you're trying to make the business case or do the right thing and all those things, sometimes those arguments fall flat for a lot of people.
Great. Other questions? You had one? Russell?
So first I want to thank the panel for a wealth of information. I personally came here tonight seeking clarification around a number of diversity and inclusion concepts and practices. And what I'm now walking away with is a better understanding of the role of diversity in creating a level playing field, and the role of an artificial intelligence machine learning system and company being sort of the tipping point to continue this massive change that's underway. And I'm very interested in your views on the idea of Eightfold.ai being sort of part of this massive change and being a tipping point for actually bringing this change into the organizations in such a way that it inspires the leadership, and it deals with the habits and memory, and it deals with the quantitative validation, and it deals with the inspiration from the leaders, starting with the board and the decision makers of the organization. So if you could share with me your views on the next steps in this process that AI can help drive this change in meaningful ways in organizations for leaders, managers, and the staff.
Well, I love the phrase, what happens next, because from the brain's perspective, the only thing that matters is what happens next. So as you're reflecting even on your own content or your own strategies, the more that you clarify for anybody's brain what the future brings, that's a sure way to get the brain to move a little bit more in your favor. This is why I was enjoying, a few of you have mentioned this notion of expectations. When you feed the brain's expectations for the next future step, you have the brain's attention and energy. And why is that? Because the brain has been designed to be constantly in the future. So it may not necessarily have all the answers about what the future is going to bring, but at least we can try. But the minute that you say to the brain, this is what the future will bring, you have it in there, because we have been designed to be constantly on fast forward. We are in the next moment, just very much like you probably are anticipating the food and the drinks in just a few minutes. So we want to be in the future. How do we know where to go in the future? By going to the past and recollecting memories that have served us well. I know this is going to be a strange comment, but there's very little evolutionary value in the present. We want to be constantly in the future. So as you're looking at your own strategies, you're mentioning some marketing campaigns or some things that you want to do, diversity and inclusion included. Can you clarify and can you help the brain predict the next moment? And when you do, you will have its attention and energy to act.
I think one thing that I would add as an executive, right, quite a few times, especially, and I think Bernard, one point that you were alluding to is that many people are talking about it, but AI can also help us measure the impact of that, right? What is really going to do it for the organization, right? What I see quite a few times in organizations, like you talk about things, but people are still not completely bought into it. They're like, yeah, you're doing it, are you doing a lip service, right? And sometimes as an executive, as a board member, if you are taking actions that are very obvious, measurable, visible, that leads to major change in the organization, that my organization is actually just not talking about it, they are serious about it. So think about what are the things you can do to communicate to the broader organization that you are genuinely serious about it and care about it. And do it and talk about it again and again and again.
I think one other thing is AI helps with encouragement and assurance. What I've noticed is people are very afraid to do the wrong thing, and they want a guidepost or some breadcrumbs to point me in the right direction. And I think if AI could be predictive in the sense that if you do these things, you will be more likely to be successful, I think people will be more apt to do something versus what is it, paralysis by analysis? We keep analyzing things, and we just like, you don't do anything, and this compounds the problem. So I think if you have solid data, and then you go, that seems like a good solution, I'll do something, versus like, I won't, I'm scared. And that's where I think most of, anytime, particularly with ethnic and racial diversity, we are paralyzed. So if we had more data to feel more sure, then we would probably go forward.
Great. Was there a question over there?
So we all agree that diversity and inclusion is a good thing to discuss and implement, right? Do you also see the possibility of a reverse bias in cases? For example, it's definitely not a lip service anymore, probably because there is so much of data available, all kinds of metrics available. In desperation to show the right metrics, do you think people might make some wrong decisions in that process, resulting in some reverse biases?
Reverse biases in the sense of let's hire those 50-year-old white programmers.
Yeah, occasionally.
Occasionally.
To show the right metrics, right? I mean, is the
Pressure so much, the discussion so much that people might end up doing, decisions other way around. And can technology help there, right? Maybe.
Yeah, if you think about how the brain decides to move, there at the very basis of it all, only three ways in which you make decisions. You make decisions based on reflexes, and the memory for those reflexes is a given. So in your brain right now, you had pre-wired as you were born some reactions. Like for instance, you know what to do when you're touching a hot stove, because thousands of years of evolution have been teaching you that skin is good to survival. If you have good skin, you're more likely to have increased biological fitness. And there are certain primary reinforcers, so to speak, that dictate to the brain what to do next. We react very quickly to sweet taste, which is why you mentioned chocolate, bitter taste, odors, temperature. We react to altruism. I love what you said about altruism. We react to sex, snakes, flowers, youth, beauty, the ability to control our environment. Those are whenever somebody promises you, by the way, as you reflect on your own messages, that you will help other people control their environment, you have the brain's reflexive action. So reflexes is one way. Another way we act is based on habits like we've been discussing. And the third way is a goal-oriented behavior. So for example, if you habitually take the same route to work as every day, and the minute that you see some road construction, now you actually have to think. So unlike reflexes and habits, goal-oriented decisions require a lot more cognitive energy from the brain. So obviously, given the choice, what would you rather do? Think in a goal-oriented way or go based on reflexes and habits? After a day like this, if you had to go home and open the refrigerator because you have been expending so much cognitive energy, what do you reach for, the chocolate or the broccoli? So in order for people to make decisions, then you have to ask how much cognitive energy do they have left in order to analyze the data. And unfortunately, regardless of whether that data is accurate or not, or if we know what the direction to go in, is we have to ask, does the brain have enough energy right now to make conscious, deliberate decisions? And because so many of our audience as customers operate in a state of partial attention and sleep deprivation, it's no wonder that even given the right data, we still don't make the right decisions that serve us well. So keep your employees healthy and awake, and they're more likely to decide in your favor.
Any other questions?
I had two very quick comments. As an older person, I'm now an empty nester, and so when my kids were younger, I had to, I came in late because I dropped them off. I left early at 5 because I had to pick them up. And now that I'm empty nester, and I was interviewing recently for work, I said I'm a free bird. And I feel a freedom that I didn't have before. I can stay as late as you need or whatever. So I think that was worked to my advantage recently when I was looking for work. So I would say to those of you that are older, if that's the case for you, it's very different from when you were tied to daycare for the young ones. The second quick comment is, I don't know how many of you have heard of the blind interviews for orchestra. Orchestras have very few women, and so one of the experiments they were doing is to have a curtain, and you were interviewing the candidates behind the curtain, and 50% more women were being hired because you couldn't tell if the music was being played by a male or female. Initially, as you walked onto the stage, there was click, clack of the heels, so they had to put a carpet down so that you couldn't tell the shoe. But anyway, so one, you were talking about biases in interviews. Another idea might be these sort of blind interviews where you literally do not know who's on the other side of the curtain. And so then your biases go away because you're just listening to what the music that they're playing for you.
Excellent. Excellent. So we have a lot of wine waiting upstairs. So why don't we adjourn? Thank you, everyone. I mean, fantastic. Really enjoyed it. I think they're all up there as well, so we all get to spend a little more time with them. But thank you all for coming. Hope this was useful.